What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That question didn't come from a book or some wise old guru on TV. It came uninvited, sharp and unsettling, as Walter Briggs sat alone at his small kitchen table in Des Moines, Iowa, watching the evening news on a flickering screen that hadn't been updated since the Bush administration. It was just past 6, the kind of time when light began to fade and shadows started creeping up the walls like old regrets. Outside, the world was moving into twilight. Inside, Walter sipped cold coffee from a mug that still bore the faded imprint of the NASA logo. It had been Marie's favorite. 6 years now since she passed, but her fingerprints, her warmth, her fierce belief in him, those things lingered in everything he hadn't yet boxed away. The news anchor's voice broke through the hum of silence. SpaceX's Starship completes major test flight. Despite mid-air failure, Elon Musk calls the mission a success. A shaky cell phone video followed, a giant rocket soaring into the heavens, a gleaming metal spear tearing across a bright blue sky. Then came the boom, fiery, explosive, final. The rocket disintegrated mid-air, debris tumbling down like mechanical ashes. Most people watching probably shook their heads. Another billionaire's toy. Another big failure. But Walter sat up, something ancient and electric stirring in his chest. There was something about the way Elon Musk stood afterward, surrounded by smoke and applause, smiling like a man who saw only what was next. "This is how we learn," Musk said in the clip, eyes glinting. "Failure is part of forward." Walter froze. The words hit him somewhere deep, where most things had gone numb. He hadn't built anything in years. Not since the retirement party where they gave him a gold clock he never wound and a plaque that gathered dust on the floor behind his recliner. Not since his hands stopped being strong enough to grip a wrench for long. Not since Rachel stopped calling him Dad and started calling him Walter when she was angry. Not since Marie. He leaned closer to the screen as the replay continued. The rocket had lifted into the sky with such beauty, such violence, and then, bam. And yet Elon called it a success. That wasn't how Walter had been raised. Failure was shameful. It meant someone didn't prepare enough, didn't study hard enough, didn't work hard enough. You didn't blow things up and call it a win. And yet, failure is part of forward. That line hung in the air like rocket smoke. For most of his life, Walter had tried to avoid failure at all costs. It had kept him safe, sure. But it had also kept him stuck. He designed a lunar habitat module in 1984. A good one. Innovative. Lightweight. Cost-efficient. NASA had shelved it. Politics, budget cuts, newer minds in the room. He never pitched another design again. He became a reviewer, then a manager, then a retiree. Fade to black. But that line, Musk's line, it rattled the walls of his comfort. He looked over at the garage door, dusty and silent. Behind it lay shelves of old blueprints, models, boxes of tech manuals from another era. He hadn't opened any of it since Marie passed. She used to tell him he wasn't done yet. That his mind still had orbits to make. He hadn't listened. Until now. Failure is part of forward, he whispered, like it was a password unlocking something long sealed. He reached for the remote, paused, and looked directly into the lens of his memory. He could see it as clearly as if it were yesterday, the day they told him his lunar module wouldn't fly. He'd stayed late that night, fiddling with the model in the lab, trying to make peace with the silence that followed. No one had asked him how it felt. No one had told him to try again. He'd gone home, kissed Marie, and never brought the design up again. 64. That's how old he was when she died. 72 now. 8 years older. And yet, somehow, this failure of a rocket had made him feel younger than he had in decades. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent a lifetime avoiding explosions. Now one had sparked something alive. A text popped up on his phone, Rachel. Have you looked at the senior living packet I sent? We need to talk. He stared at it, finger hovering. Then he put the phone down and stood. His knees cracked, his back screamed, but his body obeyed like it hadn't in months. He walked to the garage, flicked on the light. Dust motes danced in golden shafts like memories. Everything was just as he'd left it. Boxes labeled Lunar HAB and Apollo Tech Ref sat stacked in the corner. His old drafting table stood against the far wall, an untouched relic. The chair still held Marie's crocheted blanket. He sank into it slowly, almost reverently, and stared at the yellowed blueprint rolled in its protective tube. He cracked the seal. The paper unfurled with a soft whoosh, revealing lines, angles, dreams. Marie 1, he whispered. That's what he'd called it, in secret, after her. He hadn't even told her that part. The module was beautiful, and in some ways, it had been ahead of its time. But time had moved on. Until now. Now it seemed like time was bending back toward him. That's when the second voice joined his mind, quiet but unmistakable. Marie. Or the memory of her. You still have one more in you, Walt. He ran his fingers across the blue ink. It trembled, not with weakness, but with anticipation. The news report played again in his mind. The roar of the rocket. The fire. The failure. The smile. Maybe it wasn't about age. Maybe it was about ignition. He pulled his phone back out, this time not to read Rachel's text, but to open YouTube. He found the full clip. Rewatched it. Then again. We're going to Mars, Musk said in the post-launch press conference. And every test, even the ones that explode, bring us closer. That was the second line. That one sealed it. Walter didn't want to go to a senior center. He wanted to go to Mars. Or at least, help someone else get there. Before his time ran out. He'd let go of everything that made him who he was because he thought the world had let go of him first. But maybe he'd just been waiting, for permission, for fire, for something big enough to believe in again. That rocket may have exploded in the sky, but it landed right in his soul. Tomorrow, he decided, he would open every box in this garage. Tomorrow, he would draft again. Tomorrow, he would build. But for tonight, he just sat there in the quiet, blueprint in hand, coffee gone cold, surrounded by the ghosts of old dreams and the flicker of something daring and new. If you're reading this, maybe you're sitting alone too. Maybe your rocket has already exploded, or maybe it never launched at all. But listen, failure is part of forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Walter Briggs had once believed he would help send people to the moon again. Not in theory, not in passing, he believed it with the full force of a young man whose hands shook when he first held his NASA badge. That was in 1971, the year after Apollo 13, when space still felt like destiny and not just memory. He wasn't a pilot or a commander. He wasn't one of the heroes who came back in ticker tape parades. He was an engineer. Ground crew. Problem solver. His world wasn't the stars but the tiny lines on a blueprint that had to be exactly right if anyone hoped to make it there alive. He lived for the details. For the numbers. For the long nights when he and a roomful of exhausted minds argued over pressure valves and oxygen loadouts and hull integrity. He loved it. It mattered. And then, somehow, it ended. It didn't stop all at once, like a door slamming shut. It was slower than that. Quieter. His first design was passed over for a newer concept out of MIT. Then came the budget cuts. Then came the missions that never got greenlit. The lunar habitat he had put his soul into was quietly shelved during a reorganization in 1986. He kept working, of course. Moved into systems review. Then project evaluation. Then management. He rose in title and fell in passion. And by the time retirement arrived with its gold clock and half-hearted applause, he didn't recognize the man they were honoring. He went home that day and Marie had a cake ready in the shape of a rocket. She smiled too brightly. Kissed his cheek. Said all the right things. But her eyes told the truth, she saw the dimming in him. She saw it before he did. For a few months, he tried to stay busy. Built a few models. Cleaned the garage. Read the papers, at least the ones that still covered science. He and Marie would watch old Star Trek reruns and he'd complain about how unrealistic the warp drives were, and she'd laugh and call him her grumpy astronaut. He still had his mind, but no outlet. Still had his tools, but no mission. And eventually, even those routines started to fade. They took a cruise once. Alaska. That was her dream. She wore a blue windbreaker and leaned out over the railing like she could taste the horizon. He mostly watched her. She always seemed in motion, even when standing still. A few months later, the pain started. Stomach at first. Then spreading, like fire beneath her skin. Pancreatic. By the time they caught it, the doctors didn't offer timelines, they offered condolences. Walter spent the last 6 weeks of her life sitting by her bed, feeding her soup she couldn't keep down and listening to her voice go from melody to whisper. She apologized more than once. He never understood why. The morning she died, he stayed in the room for hours after the nurse had gone. Just him and Marie. And silence. Real silence. Not the kind you fill with hobbies or TV or the hum of appliances. The kind that rearranges your bones. He didn't go into the garage after that. Couldn't. He didn't throw anything out, he wasn't ready for that either. He just shut the door and walked past it for the next 6 years. Every day. Sometimes he'd catch himself reaching for it, keys in hand, before he remembered what it represented. The past. The not quite. The half done. And the woman who used to believe he still had one more idea left in him. He lived like that for years. Slow mornings. Slower evenings. Visits from Rachel that grew shorter and less frequent. Phone calls that became texts. Then reminders about assisted living brochures and calls from doctors who always seemed surprised he was still managing on his own. He'd laugh. I used to plan space missions. I think I can handle the stairs. But truthfully, the stairs had become harder. His legs didn't bend like they used to. His back ached in new places. He slept in the recliner more often than his bed. Sometimes he'd stare at the photos on the mantel, him and Marie in 1982 at Kennedy Space Center, a launch behind them. Him and Rachel when she was 10, holding her science fair ribbon. And then just him. Alone. The camera had kept clicking, but life had stopped posing. His neighbors were kind but distant. Most had moved on to new families, new homes. A few had passed. The world had grown faster, louder, more complicated. He no longer understood the music on the radio. The cars looked like spaceships. The news felt like static. And then one day, with no warning, a rocket exploded on the news and everything changed. It had been years since anything had made him sit upright. Not out of fear or pain, but something else. Recognition. He'd spent decades watching his own relevance fade like a mission patch on an old uniform. But when Musk said, "Failure is part of forward," Walter felt something ignite. Because if failure was no longer the end, maybe relevance wasn't either. He thought back to the lunar habitat design he had crafted in the mid-80s. The one he named Marie 1, in the privacy of his own notebooks. It was never built. Never funded. He had even stopped talking about it, afraid it would sound like whining, or worse, delusion. But it had been good work. Real work. And maybe, just maybe, there was something there worth looking at again. He had all the files. All the plans. Tucked away in boxes in the garage. Back when he drew them, Mars had been fantasy. A distant red speck. But now, it was on the table. On the docket. A goal in the crosshairs of one man's refusal to accept the limits of today. Musk wasn't doing things the traditional way. He wasn't asking permission. He was blowing up rockets and calling it learning. Walter wondered what Marie would say about that. He already knew. She would smile that crooked smile of hers and say, "Sounds like someone I used to know." That thought stayed with him all night. He didn't sleep. Just sat in the recliner, the news replaying on a loop, Elon Musk's voice repeating like gospel. "We're going to Mars. And every test, even the ones that explode, bring us closer." Walter whispered those words into the empty room. Not like a mantra. Like a dare. The next morning, when the sun broke over the edge of the backyard fence, casting long shadows into the kitchen, he made his first real decision in years. He would go into the garage. Just open it. Just look. He wasn't promising to build anything. He wasn't planning a revolution. Just one step. One turn of the key. The door creaked like something waking up after a long sleep. Dust hung in the air. The old fluorescent lights buzzed angrily. And there it was, the life he had put on pause. Tools neatly arranged, untouched for half a decade. Shelves lined with labeled bins. The drafting table, draped in a thin sheet like a body at a crime scene. And in the far corner, stacked like forgotten treasure, his blueprints. He didn't touch them yet. Just stood there, heart racing. Not from exertion. From recognition. He could feel Marie in that room. Not as a ghost, but as a whisper of purpose. This is who you are. You build. You imagine. You reach. He took one slow step forward, then another. And when he finally placed his hand on the blueprint tube marked MH-1, Lunar Habitation Module, something clicked back into place inside him. A sound he hadn't heard in years. Not in his ears, in his soul. That sound rockets make before liftoff. The hiss. The pressure. The build-up. As if his whole life had been waiting for this moment. As if age wasn't a sentence, it was fuel. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if anyone would care. But for the first time in a long, long time, he did. The days that followed felt like standing on the edge of something. Not quite falling, not quite flying. Walter moved through them slowly, his body still stiff with age, but his mind was alive in a way it hadn't been in decades. Every time he passed the garage, that blueprint called to him like a voice in another room. He'd opened it once, held it in his hands, studied the curves and contours like a man staring into a mirror that showed not his face but his former self. And yet, even with the blueprint unrolled and his tools cleaned off, something inside him refused to move. He couldn't quite explain it, not even to himself. It was like standing in front of a launch pad, engines rumbling, and still choosing to delay the countdown. In the quiet moments, he questioned everything. Who was he trying to be? What was he trying to prove? There was a voice, familiar, nagging, that whispered in his mind every night before sleep. You're too old. You had your shot. Let it go. It wasn't just self-doubt. It was the world reinforcing it at every turn. Rachel's voice was part of it too, not cruel but weary, like she'd said the same thing too many times. Dad, we've talked about this. You can't keep pretending you're still 30. You're 72. You're not building rockets anymore. You need to think about your health, about the future. What she meant, though she didn't say it outright, was the kind of future that smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria peas, where you wore a fall monitor and people called you, sir, out of pity. He didn't want that future. He didn't want a slow fade into routine. He didn't want to be reduced to crossword puzzles and monthly blood tests. But maybe that was selfish. Maybe he was foolish for dreaming. The world didn't seem to have much room for people like him anymore. He tried telling himself that opening the blueprint was enough. That maybe just looking back at his life's work had value on its own. But it felt hollow. He hadn't come this far just to reminisce. And yet, every time he sat down to start modifying the design, updating it with modern materials, accounting for current payload constraints, refreshing the oxygen recycling system, he would stop halfway through the first line, hand trembling not from illness but from uncertainty. He had no team. No funding. No deadline. Just one old man in a garage surrounded by ghosts and a blueprint nobody had asked for. The doubt crept deeper. What if Marie had been wrong? What if the world didn't need another idea from Walter Briggs? What if he was chasing shadows? The news didn't help. Every other segment was about disruption, youth, progress. People in their 20s building startups in their dorm rooms, launching apps, launching satellites. Musk again, showing off a new engine prototype. He didn't seem to sleep. Didn't seem to age. Walter stared at his own hands, gnarled and spotted, and felt that old ache come back, the ache of being left behind. He didn't want to admit it, but he started avoiding the garage again. Just for a few days. Then a week. He told himself he needed to think, to research, to rest his back. But the truth was darker. He was afraid. Afraid that if he started, he might fail. And if he failed now, there'd be no coming back from it. One night, sitting in his recliner with the blueprint rolled up beside him like a companion he didn't know how to talk to, he caught a documentary rerun on late-night public television. It was about the early days of SpaceX, back when the Falcon 1 failed 3 times in a row. Footage showed Musk at the press conference after the third failure. His face was pale, exhausted, but his voice didn't waver. "If we fail again," he said, "it'll be the end of the company. But we won't. Because we don't give up." Walter watched that moment 10 times. Rewound it. Studied it. Musk wasn't pretending he wasn't scared. He just didn't let it stop him. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, eyes open, heart pounding not with fear this time but with something heavier, conviction. The next morning, he finally went back into the garage. He opened the blueprint and began sketching. It wasn't perfect. His lines wobbled. He had to look up half the materials to see if they were even still in use. The computer he tried booting up made a horrible sound and refused to cooperate. But he was moving. The countdown had started. And just when he thought maybe, just maybe, he could push through the fog, the phone rang. It was Rachel. He almost didn't answer. But he did. "Hey, Dad," she said. Her tone was already that kind of guarded gentle that people used when preparing to disagree. "Got the email from your doctor. He says your blood pressure's up. You haven't been sleeping. What's going on?" He tried to deflect. Said he was working on a little something. She didn't let it go. "Are you back in the garage?" she asked. Silence. "Dad, come on. We've talked about this. You need to slow down." "I'm not dead yet," he said, sharper than he intended. "No one's saying that, but you've had 2 scares this year. I just don't want to get a call saying you," she didn't finish. "Didn't have to. You'd rather get a call saying I wasted my last years sitting in this house waiting to fall over." "That's not fair," she said. But maybe it was. Maybe everything about their relationship had become a tug-of-war between her fear and his refusal to go gently. She sighed. "Look, I love you. But I'm scared. You're not Superman. You can't live like you're 30 again." "Maybe I can't," he said, eyes falling to the blueprint, "but I can sure as hell try living like I'm not done." She didn't respond. The silence lasted long enough for him to hear her breathing soften, her walls come back up. "Call me tomorrow," okay, she finally said. Please. I will. He hung up and stared at the phone. He knew she meant well. But there was a part of her that had already buried him. Not maliciously. Just practically. And that hurt more than he expected. The next few days were filled with tiny victories and slow defeats. He got the CAD software running, thanks to a YouTube tutorial and 30 minutes of yelling at the monitor. He mapped out a revised layout of the habitat with updated dimensions. He converted inches to metric, begrudgingly. But then his hands cramped. His neck stiffened. His eyes blurred. At one point, frustrated beyond measure, he slammed his fist down on the table and let out a sound so primal it scared him. This wasn't supposed to be easy. But he hadn't expected it to hurt this much, physically, emotionally, spiritually. That night, he found himself watching another Musk clip. This one from an old interview. The reporter asked, "Why do you keep going, even after the failures, the criticism, the pressure?" Musk stared for a second, then replied, "Because if something is important enough, even if the odds are against you, you still do it." Walter paused the video. Rewound it. Played it again. Even if the odds are against you, that was it. That was the line that broke the dam. He opened his email and wrote a message to someone he hadn't spoken to in 30 years. Howard McCaffrey, an old NASA colleague. The kind of man who never stopped tinkering, who always believed the next great breakthrough might come from a garage instead of a lab. He didn't know if the email would even go through. Didn't know if Howard was still alive. But he sent it. Told him about the project. About the blueprint. About wanting to finish what he started. And for the first time in weeks, he slept. Dreamless, but peaceful. The next morning, there was a reply in his inbox. One line. "Still got the spark, Briggs. Let me know how I can help." Walter stared at the screen, mouth open. He laughed, a short, stunned kind of laugh. Not because Howard's words were poetic. They weren't. But because they meant someone still believed he mattered. That he could still create. That he wasn't alone. For the first time, Walter didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a rocket waiting to be lit. The first thing Walter changed wasn't a schematic or a formula, it was the way he showed up. Before, he'd shuffle into the garage like a man visiting a grave, shoulders slumped, head lowered, afraid to awaken what he'd buried. But now, with Howard's email still glowing on his screen and Elon's voice echoing in his memory, he entered the garage like it was mission control. The dust didn't bother him. The stiffness in his knees didn't matter. He wasn't trying to recapture youth anymore. He was doing something else. Something better. He was reclaiming purpose. Every morning, before the sun had fully crested the backyard fence, Walter was already at the drafting table, blueprint rolled open, notes scribbled in the margins, coffee cooling beside his elbow. He wore his old NASA windbreaker, not for warmth, but as armor. It still fit, mostly. He liked how it made him feel. Less like a man waiting out the clock, more like an engineer again. An explorer. A builder. The world outside his garage still moved at its own fast, impatient pace, headlines screaming, traffic speeding, people glued to their phones. But inside, time bent differently. Slower, steadier. There were no distractions here. Just Walter, the hum of his ancient laptop, and the sound of his mechanical pencil gliding over paper. He started small, just like Musk had. Not with an entire colony module but with a single idea. How to regulate thermal loss in a lunar environment using today's materials instead of the 1980s components he'd originally spec'd. He dug into online forums. Downloaded white papers. Watched lectures from MIT that made his brain ache in the best way. Sometimes he'd fall asleep with formulas still floating in his head, dreaming of pressure domes and oxygen loops and radiation shielding. At first, the progress was slow. He hadn't used CAD software in years. His hands ached after only an hour. His computer crashed twice in one afternoon. But he didn't stop. Every mistake was a test. Every setback, a prototype. If Musk could blow up billion-dollar rockets and keep smiling, Walter figured he could survive a few glitches. Howard kept emailing. They weren't sentimental messages. Just updates, links, occasional feedback on the diagrams Walter sent. Pressure numbers look solid, check against lunar night cycles. Or, habitat frame weight might be high, have you considered modern alloys? It was like being back in the lab again. Not in body, but in brain, in spirit. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He knew that. He wasn't trying to get published, wasn't looking for funding, wasn't expecting a medal. But he was doing it for real. For the work. For the dream that still flickered, decades old but never extinguished. And slowly, one line at a time, that dream took shape again. He sketched a revised skeleton for the habitat, smaller, leaner, optimized for 3D, printing on the moon using regolith as raw material. He designed foldable solar arrays that would expand automatically after landing. He built in modular life support units that could be swapped in and out like Lego blocks. Some ideas were old. Some were new. Some were crazy. But for the first time in years, they were his. It wasn't just the work that changed, it was Walter himself. He moved differently now. Still slow, but deliberate. He started walking every morning, just around the block. Then 2 blocks. He didn't time it. He didn't track his steps. He just moved. Because he had somewhere to go. Something to return to. Neighbors started noticing. The woman across the street, the one with the yappy dog and the tidy garden, waved more often. The mailman lingered a little longer, asked what all the scribbled papers were in Walter's hands. Designs, Walter said one morning, and the word felt good on his tongue. For the moon. The mailman laughed, not cruelly, just surprised. Really? Really? Walter didn't explain. He didn't have to. The point wasn't to be believed. The point was to believe it himself. One morning, Rachel called again. He answered with a kind of ease he hadn't felt in months. Hey, kiddo, he said, cheerful, honest. She paused. You sound awake. I am. He told her, carefully, about the project. Not everything, just enough. About Howard. About the garage. About revisiting his old lunar module idea. There was silence on the other end. Not disapproval, not quite. Just hesitation. Dad, I mean, that's great, but are you okay? I'm better than I've been in years. You're not pushing yourself too hard. I'm pushing myself just hard enough. She sighed. He knew that sigh. It was the same one Marie used to make when Walter tried to fix the leaky faucet instead of calling a plumber. I'm not trying to stop you, Rachel said. I worry. I know, he said, softer now. But this isn't about proving anything. It's about finishing something I started. I need this. And maybe, just maybe, he thought, you need to see me do this. See that I'm still here. Still thinking. Still building. Rachel didn't say much more. But 2 days later, a package arrived. A new ergonomic keyboard. A note inside, for your moon base. Love you. Walter held that note for a long time. The days grew brighter after that, or maybe it was just him seeing the light differently. The more he worked, the more he remembered who he had been. Not just the engineer. The father. The husband. The dreamer. He started documenting his progress. At first, it was just photos on his old phone. Then he posted a few diagrams online. Nothing flashy. Just, an old engineer's take on lunar habitats, feedback welcome. He expected silence. Maybe a snide comment or two. But instead, something wild happened. People responded. Young engineers. Space nerds. A retired professor from Florida. They commented. Shared. Asked questions. Walter answered every one. He didn't try to pretend he had all the answers. He was clear about his limitations. But he also made it clear that limitations weren't excuses. The thread went semi-viral, at least in the small but passionate world of space design forums. One comment stuck with him. A college student wrote, "You make me believe I can still be doing this stuff when I'm your age. Thanks for showing up." That night, Walter sat at the drafting table long after the sun went down, the garage glowing with the warm light of purpose. He thought about that phrase, showing up. That was it, wasn't it? The one thing he'd changed. He showed up. Every day. Despite the pain, despite the doubt, despite the voice that said he was too old, too tired, too late. He showed up. And by doing that, everything else started to move. The idea of age as an ending, it was false. Age was just a measurement, like distance or mass. What mattered was inertia. And he was moving again. At some point that week, while sketching out a backup oxygen system that could operate independently of Earth support for 90 days, he caught himself humming. Not a song. Just a sound. A vibration. Like the hum of a ship preparing for takeoff. He didn't notice it at first. But it was there. Like an echo of something that had always lived inside him. Readiness. Drive. Hope. He remembered one of Musk's other lines, maybe the simplest and strangest one, "I'd like to die on Mars. Just not on impact." Walter laughed when he remembered it. Not because it was ridiculous, but because it was human. Elon wasn't just building rockets. He was building meaning. A reason to wake up in the morning. That's what this was all about. Not the moon. Not the math. Not even the habitat. It was about building something that said, "I was here. I mattered. I tried." In that garage, surrounded by blueprints and soldering wires and the photo of Marie he'd finally put on the wall beside his desk, Walter wasn't waiting to fade. He was lighting up. One sketch at a time. One screw at a time. One day at a time. And somewhere, he believed, Marie was watching. Maybe not literally. But in that way that love stays behind, in all the parts of us that never stop building. Walter didn't know when exactly it happened, when the work stopped being an experiment in defiance and became something much larger, something that didn't just fill the empty hours but cracked them open like windows, letting light in for the first time in years. The blueprint he'd started updating, once just a paper memory of a younger self's ambition, had become an active, breathing concept. The modules weren't just theoretical anymore, they were modeled, tested in simulation software, optimized for modularity and weight. He was learning faster than he had in decades, driven not by deadlines but by determination. Each morning, the smell of solder, the buzz of his antique monitor, and the sharp scent of ink on blue drafting paper filled the garage like incense in a cathedral. He was building again, not just a habitat for the moon, but a life worth living. And then, something happened that threw his entire project into a new orbit. One of his diagrams, one he'd casually posted to the online space engineering forum with the caption, "Lunar Regolith Shielding, Old School Engineer's Take," was picked up by a popular space blog. It wasn't huge, not CNN, not NASA's official channels, but it was real. The article, written by a young engineer in Texas, praised the pragmatic elegance of his design and the clarity of vision from someone who remembers when space wasn't just theoretical, it was tangible. Walter read those words again and again, not out of vanity but disbelief. He'd been invisible for so long. Now, suddenly, his thoughts were being discussed by strangers, quoted, even debated. Comments rolled in. Where can I read more? Has this guy ever collaborated with a university team? My aerospace class just reviewed his design. Our professor said it reminded him of early Apollo era logic, but with 21st century efficiency. Walter blinked at the screen, heart thudding in his chest. Somewhere deep inside, the ghost of his younger self stood up straight. He wasn't a relic. He was a resource. That afternoon, he opened his email and found an invitation from a graduate student at Caltech. They were organizing a virtual symposium called Lunar Design Futures, and they wanted him, Walter Briggs, to present his model during a Q&A session. Even just 15 minutes, the student wrote, would be an honor to hear your thought process. He stared at that email for a long time, hand hovering over the mouse. Every voice of doubt he had ever heard rose to the surface. You're too old. You're not polished. You'll embarrass yourself. But louder than all of those was the image of Marie, arms folded, eyebrow raised, daring him not to say yes. He clicked reply. He wrote, I'd be glad to join. Let me know the date. That week, he practiced. Not for perfection, but for clarity. He built a small PowerPoint, just bullet points and diagrams. No fluff. No fancy transitions. Just the work. The real work. The morning of the symposium, he put on his old NASA pin and cleaned up the garage behind him, setting the laptop on a milk crate to frame the camera properly. The moment the Zoom call went live, he saw the faces of dozens of students, all ages, some overseas, some in lab coats, one even sitting in a messy dorm room. And all of them, every single one, looking directly at him. Mr. Briggs, the moderator said, smiling through a digital screen, we're so excited to have you with us. We've all reviewed your recent post, and we're eager to hear more. The floor is yours. Walter's voice shook at first, but not from fear. From awe. He had lived long enough to see the circle close, to see the torch not passed, but shared. He spoke plainly. He talked about redundancy, about low Earth supply lag, about shielding from solar radiation. He showed how his model minimized risk while maximizing reusability. He didn't overpromise. He didn't oversell. And when he finished, there was silence, not the awkward kind, but the kind that told him people were thinking. One student raised a hand. Mr. Briggs, this regolith shielding design, have you considered adapting it for a Martian environment, especially given the atmospheric pressure difference? Walter grinned. I have. But I haven't modeled it yet. Maybe we could do that together. A ripple of quiet laughter. Respectful. Warm. And just like that, the Q&A bloomed. They asked about material sourcing. About modular living quarters. About psychological needs for long-term lunar isolation. And he had answers, not all of them, but enough. He didn't have to be perfect. He had to be real. Afterward, as he signed off the call, a private message appeared in his inbox. It was from one of the attendees, a young woman at MIT. Her message said, "Thank you for proving that a life of engineering doesn't expire with age. Today I realized I don't have to rush to matter. I just have to keep building." Walter sat back in his chair, eyes wet. Not with sadness, but with something deeper. Affirmation. That night, he didn't go inside right away. He stayed in the garage, lights still on, fingers still twitching with the memory of motion. He pulled out a small photo from his desk drawer, the one of him and Marie in front of the Saturn V rocket in 1982. He set it beside the blueprint, the pin still shining on his chest. He looked around at the garage. It didn't look like much. But in that moment, it felt like a launch pad. He realized he'd broken through, not to fame or fortune, but to himself. Through the wall of grief. Through the fog of doubt. Through the lie that aging meant irrelevance. He was part of something now. Again. Not because he forced it. but because he followed the one thing that never truly left him, curiosity. The next morning, he began drafting version 3.0 of the habitat. Not because he had to, but because the idea wouldn't leave him alone. He was working from a new perspective now, thinking forward, not backward. The moon was just the beginning. Mars was on the horizon. And somewhere, far beyond what he could see, another generation was waiting to build what he started. They'd remember his name, or maybe not. That didn't matter. What mattered was the work. The dream. The willingness to keep going. He thought again of Musk's voice, calm but electric. The path to Mars is full of explosions. But every explosion is one step closer to flight. Walter smiled. Amen, he whispered, and picked up his pencil. Walter never set out to become a symbol, and he certainly didn't expect anyone to call him a mentor, but as weeks turned to months and the diagrams turned to conversations and the conversations turned to invitations, something unexpected unfolded. Not in a burst of fame or recognition, but in slow, steady ripples, like a signal echoing outward from a deep space transmission, reaching people he'd never meet and yet somehow connecting them to his heartbeat, to his stubborn refusal to fade away quietly, and what began as a personal reclamation project, the old blueprint, the dusty garage, the ache in his back that told him he was still alive, had quietly transformed into something that lived beyond him, something shared, something seen, and when a young engineer named Tasha from Arizona State messaged him and asked if she could feature his lunar habitat concept in her senior thesis, Walter didn't hesitate. He scanned every sketch, explained every structural decision, and when she sent back her final draft with a dedication, to Walter Briggs, for proving that vision knows no expiration date. He stared at the words for a long time, not with pride, but with a profound and quiet gratitude, because in those simple lines, he saw that what he was building was no longer about the moon or the module or the legacy of rockets. It was about the idea that a life fully lived doesn't taper off, it evolves, and maybe the greatest discoveries come not from the young alone, but from the bridge between youth and experience, between raw energy and refined endurance, and Walter, who had once believed his time was over, now found himself waking each day not to survive it, but to build it, to offer something to the world that wasn't finished when he retired or when Marie died or when the headlines started forgetting men like him, but instead something that was only just beginning, a new trajectory defined not by speed, but by direction. And he saw now that purpose had nothing to do with age and everything to do with momentum, and if momentum could be found again at 72, then maybe, just maybe, there were more who needed to know that, more who needed to see it to believe it. And so when he received an invitation from a local community college to speak to a group of older adults returning to school for second careers, he almost said no out of instinct, that old reflex of doubt still hiding in his ribs, but then he remembered the feeling of that first Zoom call, the eyes of students looking at him not as a relic, but as a resource, and he said yes, and he showed up that Tuesday afternoon wearing the same NASA windbreaker and carrying nothing but a handful of sketches and the same story he'd told himself 1,000 times before, the story of waiting too long, the story of loss, of silence, of nearly giving up, and then, finally, the story of a single changed decision, of showing up, again, for himself. And when he finished speaking, there was silence, and then a man near the back, probably in his late 60s, raised his hand and said, "I used to work in manufacturing, thought I was done, body slowed down, brain still sharp, but I figured no one needed it anymore, until now," and another woman added, "I haven't drawn anything since 1994. I forgot how much I loved it. I think I'm gonna pick up my sketchpad again," and in that moment, Walter didn't feel like a guest speaker, he felt like a signal flare, a beacon that said, "You're not done. You're not even close." And afterward, one of the organizers asked if he'd ever considered writing a short manual about lunar structures and self-initiated research, something accessible for non-engineers, and Walter chuckled because it hadn't crossed his mind, not really, but now it felt inevitable, like the next logical step in a journey he'd once believed was behind him, and he remembered something Elon had once said. Something casual, almost tossed aside during a press Q&A, but it had stayed with Walter for years: if something's important enough, you should do it, even if the odds are against you. In fact, that's probably the best reason to do it, and that sentence became a kind of rhythm in his chest, a quiet engine that kept firing, even when the work was slow, even when his joints ached, even when the garage was too hot or too cold, or when he caught himself forgetting where he saved a file, because now he knew the truth, not the myth of youth, but the reality of endurance. That legacy isn't about fame or headlines, it's about how many people your fire lights up before it fades, and if he could light just one more, then the effort was worth it, the fight was worth it, the dream was still alive, and the dream was contagious, and so he began to teach informally, holding weekend video calls with young engineers, retirees, makers, even high school students with 3D printers and big imaginations, and he found himself energized, not drained. Lifted, not burdened. And Marie's photo remained beside his monitor, always watching, always reminding him why he kept going, not just because of what he lost, but because of what he still had to give. And one night, long after the calls were over and the diagrams saved and the coffee pot cooled, he sat back in his creaky chair, looking around the garage, and whispered aloud, "I thought this was the end, but it was just a new beginning." And in that quiet, something inside him released. Not sadness, not regret, but a kind of peaceful understanding, like touching down on the surface of something unknown and realizing it was home, and he began drafting the final version of his design, not because he was finished dreaming, but because he was finally ready to share it all, to give it away, to let others build upon it, shape it, carry it forward. And as he uploaded the plans to an open-access repository with the title, Lunar Habitat, Modular, Scalable, Survivable, Briggs version 4.1, he felt no fear, no need to hold it close, because the real invention wasn't the blueprint, it was the belief that even now, even here, even at this age, he still mattered, he still belonged to the future, and when he clicked, publish, he didn't flinch, didn't second-guess, because he knew the real rocket had already launched, the one inside him, the one that refused to fall back to Earth. And somewhere, maybe in the mind of a young girl in Nebraska or an old machinist in Maine or a student in Nairobi, someone would find that file, open it, study the lines, and think, if he can do this at 72, maybe I can do this at 20, or 40, or 80, and that thought, that simple ignition of possibility, was more powerful than any launch vehicle, more lasting than any footprint in lunar dust. And as Walter closed his laptop, hands trembling just slightly, he leaned back and whispered the words he hadn't dared say in years, not to the world, but to himself, "I'm proud of you." And that pride wasn't loud or boastful, it was quiet, steady, earned, and it filled the garage like a final, perfect chord. Walter could feel the shift, not just in his bones, but in the garage's light, the quiet that used to suffocate him now felt charged. His spreadsheets had grown thicker, his models more precise, his coffee more necessary to keep the hum alive. But what surprised him most wasn't the progress. It was Malik. The kid from next door banging on the garage door one morning, earbuds tangled around his neck, looking half cautious, half curious, like someone afraid this was a trick. "Mr. Briggs?" Malik's voice was low, hesitant. Walter looked up from his sketches, half expecting the vision to evaporate. But there he was, 17, full of nerves and possibilities. He held a rusty screwdriver. "Heard you were building something, space-related." It wasn't an interview. It was an invitation, and Walter took it. He sat and showed him the designs, the simulations, the failures, and the hope. Malik's eyes glowed. He asked questions other people didn't. About heat retention, about how many people could actually live in one of these domes. He asked about the materials. About the possibility of reuse. He asked Walter why he came back now. Walter answered, voice steady. "Because I forgot I wasn't done. Because I saw a spark in a failing rocket and remembered something about my own life." Malik nodded, like he understood more than the words could say. From that day on, Malik was there every afternoon, sometimes just to watch, sometimes to clean a drawing table, sometimes to laugh when Walter misclicked the CAD model yet again. He taught Walter how to send files through Dropbox and how to get a better webcam angle for his virtual talks. Walter taught Malik about pressure valves and airflow and how dreams needed structure, but dreams also needed patience. Malik began to sketch too, drawn by Walter's careful words, his steady faith, his vision not of failure, but of space and the self. They named the model Marie 1 together, laughing at the sentimentality, and then pausing to respect it. In that naming was continuity, the woman who believed in him, in the project, in him again. Kareem became their unofficial PR team, posting a time-lapse of the blueprint's evolution online, writing short captions that made people in their forums stop and look. The project wasn't Walter's anymore, not just his. It was shared, layered, richer. In Malik's presence, Walter felt younger, not physically, but creatively. Evening light filtered through the garage, making the metal tools shine. He watched Malik solder delicate circuits for simulated sensors. He watched how Malik's fingers were confident where his were shaky. And he realized, this wasn't about proving he could still do it. It was about teaching someone else they could. One day, Rachel showed up at the open door. She hadn't texted. She just walked. She saw Malik hunched over a small prototype, Walter pointing to schematics behind him. She stood there quietly. Walter looked up and smiled, nodding toward Malik. Rachel's face softened. That evening, she asked if she could keep the extra sketches, maybe use them for an art class project. She held one in her hands, careful, thoughtful, and said, "It's beautiful." Walter realized then that the bridge between him and Rachel was rebuilding faster than he expected. Space between them was shrinking, reparable. One night, after Malik left, Walter sat with his tools. Silence replaced. He realized something loud: Malik wasn't just learning. Walter was teaching. And not just Malik. He was teaching himself, every day. That memory they were building, hard metallic lines overlaying fragments of memory, was transforming into a scaffold for hope. And hope, he now felt, was powerful. In busier spaces online, a small space enthusiast group started calling him Blueprint Briggs. They asked for advice. Asked his opinion. Shared his designs. One asked for a version small enough to print as a model for her classroom. Walter made a simplified schematic. Someone else asked if he'd mentor their capstone. He felt the caution again, creeping in. Who was he to mentor? To share. But then Malik showed up, the look in his eyes as bright as a launch. Walter drafted the reply, yes. And he meant it. Because he realized what Elon had done for him, he hadn't saved him. He only reminded him it was never too late. One morning, Walter got an email from a small local high school. Would he come give a talk on engineering and second chances? He blinked and thought of Marie, the rocket failing on his screen, Malik's face, Rachel's softened eyes. He said yes. He showed up in faded jeans and an old windbreaker. Kids stared, some giggled. Walter started with, "I didn't know if I'd aged out of relevance. But a spark from the sky reminded me that fire isn't age-bound." He told them about designing habitats decades ago, about loss, about failure, about rediscovery. He showed them the models, the circuit boards, the simulations. He saw kids lean forward. Eyes bright. One girl raised her hand, "Are you saying I can still become an engineer even if I'm not born now?" Laughter rippled, but then Walter nodded. "Especially if you're not born now." It was half joke. Half truth. They clapped. He realized his words were light on their wings. That afternoon, he walked home lighter than he had in years. By the time the sun melted through the garage windows, he sat down at the drafting table again. But this time he paused, looking over the work. He hadn't just found purpose again. He'd built it. And now it was visible. Now it was alive. He picked up his pencil and drew the new design lines. And somewhere behind the hum of machinery and the smell of ink, he could hear Marie whispering, "You still have one more in you, Walt." And the tear that slid down his cheek wasn't sadness. It was release. It was gratitude. It was the soft roar of a rocket primed for lift, old dreams powering new liftoffs at last. The echo of progress carried beyond the confines of Walter's garage in ways he'd never expected. It began with a small ripple. A forum thread, a shared link, comments that appeared under his name next to words like inspiration and blueprint, and then the ripple became a wave. One afternoon, he opened his inbox to find an invitation from the local public library. Would he consider giving a talk about his lunar habitat project? It felt surreal. A man who once thought his creative days were over now had a community center asking to hear him speak. He paused. The old voice whispered, "What could you possibly say?" But the new voice, the one he'd nurtured in his garage, responded, "I have something to share." He accepted. That Saturday, he arrived early. Sunlight slanting through tall windows painted the room gold. Chairs were set in neat rows, older faces curious, skeptical, hopeful. He stood before them, holding nothing but the essence of his journey: loss, reawakening, models, dreams. He started simply, "I thought this might be a memorial." But it turned out to be a starting point. That line landed in the quiet like a trigger. The audience leaned in. He talked about age, about invisibility, about Marie, the blueprints, the spark ignited by a failing rocket, and Elon Musk's words that failure isn't a full stop. He talked about uncertainty, about pain, about clicking send on an email to Howard McCaffrey after 30 years of silence. He brought them the sketches, the CAD prototypes, the cluttered tables, the dusty tubes, physical proof that hope isn't an abstraction, it can be built. They asked questions. One man, retired teacher with calloused hands, said, "You gave me permission I didn't know I was missing." A woman, 82, wearing sterling earrings shaped like stars, whispered, "I just might start painting again." Walter smiled, tears silent behind his eyes. He realized the ecosystem of this project was more than formulas. It was connections. Later, someone handed Walter a little ceramic shuttle, painted blue with her name, Beth, on the wing, "For your front window," she said. He tucked it beside Marie's photo, and it was like a second blessing. Malik helped him post a community update. A local maker space wanted to host a workshop. Now, small clusters of people formed in that garage, sometimes just one curious soul, sometimes half a dozen, leaning over drawings or helping wire a sensor board. The dynamics changed. He was no longer alone, he had co-creators. And each day, Walter's body and spirit felt the incumbent shift. Less like someone clinging desperately to meaning, and more like someone handing off the torch. He started leading Saturday sessions, open hours, design and purpose, no charge. A high school kid working on his science fair stopped by, said he was building a time capsule with lunar regolith, he meant soil. They tinkered together. A retiree with shaky fingers learned to trace with precision and became the gallery photographer for the project. The workshop became alive in a way that a lone blueprint never could. Walter found himself sitting late at night, watching shadows ripple across diagrams with tools arranged like comrades around him. He was tired, but he was full. He logged into an email from a philosophy professor who called his journey a case study in late-life innovation. It made him wince, too formal, but he understood. The system had shifted. He spent nights revising his original model into something more inclusive, more accessible. Modular kits, he started calling them, small-scale components anyone could build in their garage. He documented instructions, made a guide. He posted it online with the tagline, "Built in Des Moines, Iowa, shared with the world." He didn't expect much. But replies started to pour in. A retired machinist in Wisconsin printed a vertical section and posted a photo of it in his workshop. A teacher in California printed them in cardboard to demonstrate airlock design to kids. A 68-year-old woman in Vermont said it gave her something to wake up for again. And Walter, seated in the warm light of that garage, understood that the real architecture wasn't of metal foam or heat shields. It was of human hearts. He watched footage of Starship's 9th test flight again, engines cutting off, separation, but then debris raining down. The mission failed in some ways, succeeded in others. It mirrored everything he'd come to understand: progress is messy. Tangible. Reaching for Mars means breaking here and there first. He smiled when Musk once wrote that rejection was expected and baseline success would have been irrational to hope for. Musk's unapologetic acknowledgement of possible failure gave him permission to begin again. And that gave dozens of others permission too. He installed a small plaque on the garage wall: "Failure is learning." Someone etched beneath it, "And learning is living." Walter slept better. His body hurt less. His back still reminded him he was older. But his soul didn't ache like it used to. The legacy he accepted wasn't monuments or plaques. It was quiet lives rekindled, curiosity rediscovered, bridges rebuilt. And when Malik, now accepted into an engineering program, handed Walter a 3D, printed miniature of Marie 1, he whispered, "You started something bigger than yourself." Walter held it, tiny but real, and whispered back, "We did." The next morning, he expanded his community sessions to include Saturdays for kids, evenings for retirees, and monthly, lunar design nights. He even started drafting a simple guide, the Briggs Blueprint Primer, for anyone aged 65 and up who thought it was too late. It would lean into resilience, not perfection. Into presence, not past. It would say, "You matter, and your hands remember how." Walter knew now that age isn't a boundary, it's a vantage point. From here, he could see farther. And those who joined him could see farther too. The garage, once silent, now pulsed with possibility. Each blueprint, each question, each crafted part, each remembered dream, it was life remade. And the launch continued, not in space, but in people's souls. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Every inventor knows that the hardest blueprint to redraw is the one you destroyed within yourself. Walter felt this keenly as he powered on his aging laptop one groggy Saturday morning, sketching new notes above a faded drawing titled Marie 1 MU Stack V2. The garage was quiet, save for the faint hum of the fridge and the soft pulse of nostalgia. The blueprints, layers of dust and memory, converged in his mind: the 1980s moon habitat, the smell of drafting ink, the night his proposal was shelved, the slow exhale of all his ambition. His pulse thudded. He drew a new insulation loop, considering modern materials. He adjusted support struts for 3D, printed regolith foam. The ideas felt alive, unlike what he'd been feeling for years. Then the ghost visited again, the memory of that day in '86 when the dream died. The boardroom. The polite dismissals. The shrugging shoulders as his concept was labeled outdated. He remembered the deflating buzz in his chest as he left, drawing his coat tight against the cold and carrying his blueprints like sacks of regret. That memory pressed on him now, even as his hand traced lines on paper. The next day, he watched one of Elon Musk's interviews again. An old one from CNBC where Musk had said, "When I started SpaceX, I thought we would fail. I thought maybe we had a 10% chance of reaching orbit." Musk's calm acceptance of risk echoed in Walter's chest. Maybe Walter had underestimated how far his vision could reach if he dared trust it again. He recalled another recent Musk note: a friend had shown him a compilation of rocket failures, and Musk said SpaceX only had about a 10 to 20% survival chance. Walter realized they both had stood at the precipice, chest tight with the same fear. But then they chose differently. That afternoon, he wanted someone to see his work, someone from his past with clarity. He opened the email draft to Howard McCaffrey. He started typing, "I know it's been decades. You never answered. But I've changed the design. I want you to see it again." He paused, hands shaking, then he hit send. A minute later, another ping: "I'd love to. Reminds me of why we did this in the first place. Let's talk." Walter exhaled, long and low. The phone rang. It was his daughter, Rachel. His heart stalled. He almost didn't answer but then pressed accept. Her voice was soft, fragile. Watched one of your talks. About life still happening. I wanted to say it made me cry. He didn't hide his relief. He told her he'd been working on something he once thought lost. She listened. Then she asked about the design, what materials he'd changed, what the latest countermeasures were. He launched into the idea of foldable heat shield tiles, how they were lighter, more resilient, how he'd integrated a backup oxygen loop, how the structure could leap from the moon to Mars with minor tweaks. She was quiet and then, that's so like you. Defying gravity. The call ended, but the warmth lingered. Walter worked late that night. Every whir of the solder, every creak of his chair, every cursor blinking on screen, built momentum. The past still haunted him, but alongside it burned a younger fire. A draft arrived from Howard the next morning. I've got some engineers who want in. They've seen the work. They're interested. That felt like the first launch of his heart after years of waiting. He called Malik, who bounded in with energy, the joy of youth, the spark he needed. They sketched together. They argued about structural loads and oxygen per person calculations and the second law of thermodynamics. Malik said, "You were talking about backup power systems. I think I could find space on campus to test that." Tears came again, not sorrow, but release, like a valve that held too much stillness. That afternoon, news broke that SpaceX had scrubbed its 10th Starship test due to a ground system LOX leak, and would try again Monday. Walter smiled at how life echoed rocket science, unfinished tests, delays, but everything aligned for the next push. If Musk could push through leaks and stand fast, so could he. He drafted a message to Malik's campus group, "Want to build a bench test for the oxygen loop?" And they replied, "Count us in." The garage filled with plans and voices. He traced new structural outlines, marking where Howard's team might adapt them. It wasn't the moon yet, but it was a real liftoff at last. In the evenings, he glanced at Marie's photo, her crooked smile, her belief, and he breathed, "I did it, Marie. I'm not done yet." The blueprints weren't just lines on paper. They were bridges across time, between who he was, who he lost, and who he was still becoming. And as the stars wheeled beyond the diamond sky, distant, brilliant, eternal, Walter Briggs, 83, ex-engineer, was building again. Walter's mornings began with a ritual, the soft buzz of his laptop warming up, the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the quiet anticipation of connection. The email thread with Howard's team was alive with blueprints, questions, and suggestions. It was a far cry from the silence that had once swallowed his work whole. But more than technical progress, Walter felt something deeper, a rekindling of trust, not just in his ideas, but in himself. For decades, he'd been the man who quietly slipped away, the engineer who stopped dreaming. Now, with every message sent, every plan shared, he was the man who rebuilt, step by tentative step. He set a date for a video call with Howard's team, a diverse group of engineers scattered across the Midwest, some fresh out of college, others seasoned veterans who had witnessed the dawn of the space shuttle era. They talked through designs, debated materials, and, perhaps most importantly, shared stories about why they cared. One young woman, Kayla, explained how her grandmother, a former NASA scientist, inspired her to study aerospace. Another engineer, Joe, confessed he'd longed to build something meaningful after years in corporate cubicles. Walter realized this wasn't just about machines, it was about legacy. That afternoon, Malik arrived with his backpack stuffed with sensor parts and enthusiasm. "Ready to build that oxygen loop?" he asked, eyes bright with the energy of youth. Walter smiled and nodded. The garage transformed into a laboratory. A symphony of soldering irons, measuring tapes, and laughter. Walter showed Malik how the backup system worked, a small, sealed chamber designed to recycle oxygen efficiently during habitat depressurization. Malik's fingers worked nimbly, connecting wires and circuits, asking questions that stretched Walter's memory and knowledge. They tested the loop with compressed air, monitoring pressure drops and sensor feedback. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and that was enough. Later, Walter called Rachel. This time, their conversation lingered longer, a bridge of words mending years of silence. She asked about the oxygen loop and whether Walter had thought about using renewable energy to power the habitat. Walter realized that she wasn't just listening, she was curious. "I'd like to visit the garage someday," she said. Walter's heart warmed. "I'd like that too." The next day, he uploaded photos and schematics to a private forum Howard set up. A safe place for collaborators to brainstorm and support each other. The messages flowed in, ideas for lightweight solar panels, questions about radiation shielding, suggestions for modular design that could be assembled piece by piece. Walter saw his dream growing, not alone, but in community. Meanwhile, news from SpaceX kept coming. Starship's 10th test flight was rescheduled again after minor glitches, the media buzzing with speculation and excitement. Walter found strength in Elon's persistence, the repeated cycle of testing, failing, learning, trying again. He started incorporating Musk's mindset into his talks at the library and community workshops. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's a vital part of the journey. One afternoon, a new visitor appeared at the garage, Lila, a retired architect and longtime neighbor who'd watched Walter's quiet transformation with curiosity. She carried a folder of sketches and said, "I think I can help with the habitat design." Together, they explored spatial layouts, optimizing for comfort and safety. Lila brought a fresh eye, reminding Walter that building something for the future also meant caring about the lives inside. The garage felt fuller, more than just parts and plans. It was a gathering place, a workshop for dreams. Walter began journaling again, words flowing about resilience, purpose, and the strange, beautiful dance between age and ambition. One entry read, "We are not relics. We are explorers in the final frontier of life." And for the first time in years, Walter believed it. The sun poured golden light through the dusty windows of Walter's garage, catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the warm air. The once silent space now buzzed softly with the sounds of soldering, quiet conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Walter sat at his workbench, fingers tracing the edges of a prototype airlock hatch he'd designed, a relic of his past meeting the promise of the future. The project had grown from a lonely dream into a community endeavor. Each day, more hands joined the effort, young students hungry for knowledge, retirees seeking a renewed sense of meaning, neighbors drawn by curiosity. Walter watched as Lila carefully measured a model habitat layout, while Malik and Kayla debated the merits of a new sensor design over the flickering glow of a computer screen. It was a tableau of hope, of people refusing to be defined by age or circumstance. Yet beneath the progress, Walter wrestled with a shadow of doubt. Was he chasing a dream that belonged to another era? Could an old man really contribute meaningfully to a future reaching beyond Earth? In those quiet moments, he turned to Musk's words. "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That idea had been a beacon ever since he first heard it, a radical refusal to give up, no matter the obstacles. He remembered the night he stayed up late reworking the oxygen loop circuitry, feeling every ache in his joints but fueled by something more powerful than youth, determination. That night, the phone rang. It was Rachel. "Dad," she said softly, "I was thinking about visiting. Maybe bring the kids. I want them to see what you're building." Walter's throat tightened. The years of silence, of distance, seemed to fold into that moment of connection. "I'd love that," he said. When they arrived a week later, the garage was alive with activity. Rachel's children marveled at the models and monitors, their eyes wide with wonder. Walter showed them the blueprints, explaining in simple terms the dream of a lunar habitat, a stepping stone to Mars, a symbol of human hope. As the children pressed questions, Walter felt a surge of joy he hadn't known in decades. In the evenings, he and Rachel talked more openly than they had in years, sharing memories, regrets, and hopes. The walls of silence were crumbling. Encouraged by the growing support, Walter began writing a guidebook, Dream Big, Build Small, a guide for late bloomers in space exploration. It was part manual, part manifesto, blending practical tips with stories of failure, resilience, and the power of daring to start again. He included anecdotes from his journey, from the sting of early rejection to the spark ignited by Elon Musk's audacity. Meanwhile, Malik had arranged a meeting with a local university engineering club. The students were eager, their enthusiasm infectious. They wanted to help build parts, run tests, and document the process. Walter saw in them the same hunger that had driven him years ago. His heart swelled with gratitude. Late one afternoon, as the sky turned lavender, Walter stood outside the garage, looking up at the stars beginning to wink into existence. The vastness of space, once an unreachable dream, now felt a little closer. He thought of Elon Musk again, how the entrepreneur had upended norms, challenged expectations, and redefined what was possible. Walter realized that he too had become a rebel, not against society, but against his own doubts and fears. In reclaiming his purpose, he'd ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. The next morning, he received an unexpected message from Howard: "We've secured a small grant to support prototype testing. Let's make history." Walter smiled, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly. Age was no longer a chain but a platform. As he prepared for the upcoming tests, surrounded by a community of dreamers and doers, Walter knew one truth: the journey was far from over. The stars awaited, and so did he. The morning air carried a chill that promised the turning of seasons, crisp and electric with possibility. Walter stood at the edge of his garage-turned laboratory, gazing over the assembly scattered with cables, sensors, and fragile circuit boards. Today was no ordinary day. After months of painstaking work, small failures, and quiet victories, the first full prototype of the oxygen loop system was ready for bench testing. It was a moment both triumphant and terrifying, a step into the unknown. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the final connections. The device wasn't perfect, no first test ever was. But it was real. This was the fruit of years of dreams deferred, of quiet years spent alone, and the spark of inspiration from a man decades younger and light years ahead in innovation, Elon Musk. Walter had come to admire Musk not because he was infallible but because he embraced risk, failure, and reinvention. He saw in SpaceX's Starship test flights, the setbacks, the explosions, the eventual successes, a metaphor for his own journey. If Elon could rocket into space despite a string of failures, why couldn't he reach for his dreams again? He flipped the switch. The device hummed to life, sensors flickering and dials dancing. Data streamed into the laptop, pressure readings, oxygen levels, flow rates, numbers that told the story of life support, of survival in hostile worlds. Malik hovered nearby, eyes wide with excitement, jotting notes, his youthful enthusiasm infectious. Kayla and Howard joined in via video call, their faces glowing with encouragement and technical suggestions. The initial readings showed promise, but the system flagged a small pressure leak. Walter's heart sank. The familiar sting of disappointment threatened to pull him back into the shadows. But then he remembered Musk's words: "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." With steady breath, Walter adjusted valves, tightened seals, and rebooted the system. The second test ran longer, more stable. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the virtual room. For the first time in years, Walter felt the sweet taste of progress, not perfection, but forward motion. That evening, as the garage lights dimmed and the neighborhood settled into quiet, Walter sat back and reflected. The journey was far from over. There would be more leaks, more redesigns, more moments of doubt. But each test was a step toward something greater than himself. Inspired by Musk's vision of Mars colonization, Walter understood that building a future required embracing uncertainty, standing firm in the face of setbacks. He opened his journal and wrote, "Every failure is a lesson, every challenge a chance to grow. Age is not the enemy, fear is. The only true failure is giving up." Over the following weeks, the team's work accelerated. Malik sourced parts for an advanced filtration unit. Lila designed modular components that could be assembled on-site. Rachel visited regularly, bringing the children and sharing stories that wove together family, science, and hope. Walter's relationship with his daughter blossomed, bridging years of silence with understanding and support. Meanwhile, news from SpaceX injected fresh energy into the group. The media was abuzz with preparations for Starship's 11th test flight. Elon Musk's relentless optimism echoed in every headline. "Next week marks another giant leap toward Mars," one article proclaimed. Walter watched live feeds of the launch pad with a mix of awe and kinship. Like Musk, he was pushing boundaries, challenging expectations of what was possible at any age. The night before the scheduled test, Walter found himself standing outside, looking up at a sky studded with stars. The vastness of space, once a cold and distant dream, now felt intimate and within reach. He thought of Marie's smile, of his younger self filled with hope and ambition. He thought of the community around him, the engineers, students, family, all bound together by a shared belief that new beginnings were possible. And he thought of Elon Musk's fearless example, a reminder that to reach for the stars, one must first dare to launch. When the morning came, Walter assembled his team in the garage, their faces shining with anticipation. They ran through final checks, tested sensors, and double-checked connections. Malik cracked a grin. "Let's do this." The test began. Data streamed in, steady, reliable, hopeful. For hours, the oxygen loop cycled flawlessly, filtering, circulating, sustaining. Walter's chest swelled with pride. They had done it. The prototype had passed its first major test. Tears welled up unbidden. This was more than technology, it was a testament to perseverance, to hope reborn in the twilight years. In that moment, Walter realized something profound: it was never too late to change, to build, to dream. Age was not an anchor, but a rocket fuel, fueled by experience, resilience, and the courage to begin again. The team celebrated, their laughter and cheers filling the once silent garage. Walter looked around at the faces, young and old, hopeful and determined, and knew this was only the beginning. The journey to the stars, to Mars, to new frontiers, was a shared voyage. And he was finally on board. Walter woke before dawn, the house silent except for the soft ticking of the old clock in the hallway. The quiet seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on him with memories and doubts. At 84, the years felt like both a gift and a burden. His joints ached more, his breath was shallower, the mirror showed a man lined with time and loss. Yet, beneath the surface, a fire still burned, kindled by a hope that refused to fade. He sat at his desk, staring at the half-finished journal where he had poured months of reflections. The words on the page seemed inadequate to capture the complexity of aging, the fear of being forgotten, the sting of missed chances, the loneliness that wrapped around him like a cold shroud. But there was also something else, a spark, a stubborn light of purpose that kept him moving forward. Walter's thoughts drifted to Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of impossible goals. How, despite failures and criticism, Musk pushed forward with a vision that transcended doubt. Walter often wondered if he could muster such courage, if his own years carried enough strength to break free from the past. The phone's chime shattered the morning stillness. It was Rachel. "Dad, I know it's early, but I needed to hear your voice," she said softly. Their conversation was a balm, reminding Walter he was not alone. She shared stories of her children's fascination with the Habitat project, her growing pride in her father's passion. For a moment, the weight of time lifted, replaced by connection and love. The day unfolded with a flurry of activity. Malik arrived with new equipment, Kayla brought fresh data from a recent materials test, and Lila sketched improvements to the Habitat's living quarters. Together, they tackled problems that had once seemed insurmountable. Walter marveled at how technology had changed since his youth. The digital tools, the rapid prototyping, the global networks that made collaboration possible. Yet, amid the innovation, he felt the pull of history, the lessons from his early career, the dreams shelved away, the silent sacrifices made in the name of practicality. Late that afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the garage windows, Walter took a break and stepped outside. The neighborhood was quiet, children playing in yards, neighbors chatting over fences. He thought about his own childhood, the innocence of wonder, the limitless possibilities that had seemed so real then. But time had a way of eroding dreams, replacing them with caution and compromise. Still, standing there, Walter realized that dreams could be reclaimed, reshaped, and rekindled at any age. The challenge was to keep moving forward, to let go of fear and embrace possibility. That evening, he watched a live broadcast of SpaceX's latest Starship test flight. The rocket soared into the sky, a gleaming spear aimed at the cosmos. The launch was flawless, an achievement born of countless trials, errors, and perseverance. Walter felt a kinship with the engineers behind the scenes, their dedication mirroring his own struggles. As the rocket vanished into the night, he whispered, "This is why we keep trying. Because the future is waiting." Later, he wrote in his journal, "We are not defined by what we've lost but by what we still dare to build." Age is a story, not the end of the story. The words gave him strength. Days turned into weeks, and the prototype oxygen loop project gained momentum. University students volunteered their time, local businesses offered support, and community members came to watch demonstrations with curiosity and admiration. Walter found himself invited to speak at a nearby senior center, sharing his journey of rediscovery and the lessons he'd learned from Musk's fearless mindset. "It's never too late," he told the audience. "The only limits are the ones we accept." His story resonated deeply with the listeners, many of whom had buried their own dreams under layers of doubt. Walter saw reflected in their eyes the same hunger he'd felt, the same longing for purpose. One woman approached him after the talk, tears in her eyes. "You gave me hope," she said simply. That moment crystallized Walter's belief that his work was bigger than himself. It was a beacon for others lost in the fog of age and invisibility. But even as progress unfolded, Walter's body reminded him of its limits. Fatigue came more often, and some days the simplest tasks felt daunting. There were moments of frustration, shadows creeping into his mind. Yet, he met each challenge with the same resolve Musk embodied, acknowledging failure without surrender. One evening, Malik found Walter resting in his favorite armchair, staring at the stars beyond the window. "Dad, you okay?" Malik asked gently. Walter smiled faintly. "Just thinking about how small we all are, and yet how big our dreams can be." Malik nodded. "You're inspiring me more than you know." That night, Walter dreamed of rockets and red dust, of walking on distant worlds alongside explorers old and young. He awoke with renewed determination. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was his to claim. In the quiet moments, Walter understood the truth Musk had lived, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. And so, with hands steady and heart open, Walter Briggs, a man who had once thought his time was past, reached for the stars anew. The garage was alive with movement and purpose. Walter watched as hands young and old worked side by side, Malik tightening screws with youthful precision, Lila sketching new design ideas on a whiteboard, Kayla checking sensor data on her tablet. The room echoed with the hum of collaboration, the faint scent of solder and coffee blending into a comforting aroma of shared endeavor. This was no longer just Walter's project. It had become a community mission, a tapestry woven from the dreams and skills of many. Months ago, he would have never imagined such a scene in this quiet Midwestern neighborhood. Once, the loneliness of aging had felt like an endless winter, a slow fading into irrelevance. Now, the energy in the room was electric, a springtime of second chances. Walter thought back to the first day Malik had walked through his door, young and eager with his backpack full of parts. That moment had sparked something, a connection bridging generations, reminding Walter that age was a state of mind, not a cage. The prototype oxygen loop was nearing completion, but Walter knew the journey was far from over. They were building more than a machine, they were building hope. Howard's remote team had sent blueprints for a new habitat module that could be tested in their garage. The design was modular, flexible, a lifeboat for humanity's next great adventure. Walter marveled at the possibilities, imagining astronauts stepping into a small home on the Moon or Mars, breathing the air he had helped to purify. In the evenings, the team often gathered around the kitchen table, sharing meals and stories. Walter found himself opening up in ways he hadn't for years, recounting youthful ambitions, regrets over missed chances, and the quiet desperation of feeling invisible. Yet, through it all, there was an undercurrent of resilience. Lila, who had once thought her architectural career was over, spoke of her excitement to apply her skills to space habitats. Malik shared his dreams of becoming an aerospace engineer, inspired by Walter's persistence. Rachel visited more often, bringing the children who peppered Walter with questions about stars, rockets, and the future. The family walls, once cold and distant, softened with laughter and understanding. Walter's journal filled with reflections not only on technology but on the power of community. He wrote, "We are stronger together. Dreams ignite when shared, and hope multiplies in the company of others." One chilly afternoon, Walter received a surprise visit from the local newspaper reporter, a woman named Clara who had heard about the garage project. She arrived with a camera crew, eager to capture the story of the retired engineer who dared to dream again. Walter hesitated but agreed, knowing the story might inspire others trapped by their own fears. The interview was awkward at first, Walter fumbling for words, the weight of years pressing down. But as he spoke about Musk's influence, the importance of perseverance, and the joy of rebuilding his purpose, something shifted. His voice grew steady, eyes bright with conviction. The article, published the following week, painted Walter not as a relic of the past but as a beacon of possibility. Letters and emails poured in, messages from strangers who saw themselves in Walter's journey. "I'm 70 and just started learning to code," one reader wrote. "Your story gives me courage," said another. Walter was overwhelmed, humbled. The garage had become a lighthouse for those feeling adrift in the storm of aging. Meanwhile, SpaceX's Starship program pressed onward, each test flight bringing humanity closer to Mars. Walter followed the news obsessively, drawing parallels between Elon Musk's unwavering drive and his own slow, steady progress. One evening, watching a live stream of a Starship launch, Walter whispered, "We're all part of this journey, each of us reaching for the stars in our own way." His team rallied around a new challenge, designing a sustainable water recycling system for the habitat. It was a complex problem, but the group tackled it with enthusiasm, blending old-school engineering principles with cutting-edge technology. The garage buzzed late into the night, a laboratory of dreams where age was no barrier to innovation. Walter's health was fragile but steady. He learned to listen to his body, balancing bursts of energy with rest. His daughter Rachel arranged for him to see a specialist who encouraged physical therapy, helping Walter regain some strength. The simple act of walking became a daily victory, a symbol of his ongoing transformation. One crisp morning, as the first snow dusted the neighborhood, Walter and Malik tested the water system prototype. The device hummed quietly, filtering and purifying with efficiency beyond expectations. Cheers erupted in the garage. Walter's eyes filled with tears, not just for the success, but for the journey that had brought them here. Later, sitting by the fireplace, he reflected on the path he had traveled, from isolation to connection, from doubt to determination. Elon Musk's influence had been a spark, but the true power came from within and from the people who had joined his quest. Walter's final journal entry that day read, "Purpose is a flame that can be rekindled at any age. When we reach out, we find hands ready to hold ours. Together, we build the future." The garage, once a quiet refuge, was now a sanctuary of hope, innovation, and renewal, a testament to the idea that it's never too late to dream, to change, to matter. And as the snow fell softly outside, Walter knew that the stars were not just distant points of light but destinations within reach, for him, for his community, and for all who dare to leap toward the unknown. The winter winds howled outside, rattling the old windows of Walter's house, but inside the garage, the air was warm with the buzz of determination and quiet hope. Walter sat at his cluttered workbench, eyes scanning the data streaming from the latest test of the water recycling system. Each successful cycle of filtration was a small victory, a promise that humanity's dreams of survival beyond Earth were inching closer to reality. The project had grown far beyond a solitary passion, it had become a mission, a shared purpose that bound generations together. Walter's thoughts wandered to Elon Musk once again, the man who had, against all odds, changed the trajectory of space exploration. Elon's relentless pursuit of Mars colonization had inspired Walter to reclaim his own life, to refuse the fading narrative society often imposed on aging bodies and minds. That night, as snow blanketed the quiet neighborhood, Walter received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Invitation to Mars Citizen Forum." Curiosity prickled at him as he clicked open the message. It was from a new online platform launched by SpaceX, inviting citizens from around the world to engage in discussions, share ideas, and help shape the future of Mars colonization. The forum was designed to bring together experts, enthusiasts, and dreamers, people like Walter. For a moment, he hesitated. Was he ready to step into this broader arena, to share his voice with the world? The fear of invisibility, the very thing that had once held him back, flared. But then came Elon Musk's words echoing in his mind, "If you're trying to create a company, it's like baking a cake. You have to have all the ingredients in the right proportion." Walter realized that his own life had been a mix of ingredients, experience, failure, hope, and resilience. And now was the time to add his voice to the mix. He typed a tentative response, accepting the invitation. Over the following days, Walter explored the forum, awestruck by the diversity of participants. Young engineers shared blueprints, educators posted lesson plans, retired scientists contributed insights. The energy was palpable, a digital campfire around which dreamers gathered to envision humanity's future. Walter posted his own introduction, sharing the story of his late-blooming journey and the prototype oxygen loop his community was building. The responses were immediate and warm. People from across the country, even the globe, sent messages of encouragement, technical advice, and shared experiences. One message stood out, a direct reply from a SpaceX engineer who had been inspired by Walter's persistence. "Your story reminds us that innovation isn't just about youth or speed, it's about heart and endurance. Keep pushing forward." The exchange renewed Walter's spirit. He found himself staying up late, engaged in lively discussions, learning, and contributing. The forum became a virtual extension of the garage, a new space for connection and growth. One evening, during a live Q&A session with Elon Musk streamed on the platform, Walter listened intently. Elon spoke about the challenges of colonizing Mars, the technical hurdles, the psychological demands, the necessity of community. When Elon mentioned the importance of diversity in age and background, Walter felt a surge of validation. Here was a leader who saw value beyond the typical definitions of success. Inspired, Walter drafted a proposal for a mentorship program, pairing experienced retirees with young aspiring engineers and scientists. He imagined a world where wisdom and innovation flowed freely across generations, where no one was too old to contribute. The forum embraced the idea, and soon Walter was coordinating virtual meetings, guiding discussions, and witnessing seeds of collaboration sprout into concrete projects. The mentorship program was more than a plan, it was a symbol of hope, a bridge spanning the gap that so often separated the old and the young. In his garage, Walter continued to refine the oxygen loop and habitat prototypes, now bolstered by new ideas and support from the forum community. Rachel and the grandchildren visited frequently, their questions growing more sophisticated, their excitement contagious. Walter felt his family's walls of silence finally replaced by bridges of understanding. Yet, amid the successes, Walter's body reminded him of its fragility. Some mornings, the ache in his knees was sharper, his breath more labored. But he faced these challenges with the same grit Musk modeled. Acknowledging limits without surrendering dreams. One afternoon, as he rested in his chair, a message popped up on his screen, a video from Elon Musk himself. The video was part of a new campaign highlighting stories of ordinary people making extraordinary contributions to space exploration. Elon spoke directly to Walter, his voice steady and sincere. "Walter, your journey shows us all that age is not a barrier to innovation or impact. Keep pushing, keep dreaming. The future needs you." Walter's eyes brimmed with tears. The words were more than encouragement, they were a lifeline, a reminder that his story mattered in the grand tapestry of humanity's quest for the stars. He shared the video with his team, who erupted in applause and renewed vigor. That evening, as snowflakes drifted outside the window, Walter sat quietly, the glow of the computer screen reflecting his steady gaze. He realized that his life, once marked by silence and solitude, had become a chorus of voices united by a common dream. The journey to Mars was no longer a distant fantasy but a shared purpose, one that transcended age, geography, and circumstance. Walter understood that Elon Musk had been more than an inspiration, he was a catalyst who had ignited a fire within countless individuals, proving that the impossible could be pursued at any stage of life. Walter's journal entry for that night captured the truth he had come to live: the stars do not belong to the young alone. They are a destination for all who dare to dream and act. Our time is now. The garage was quiet as Walter prepared for bed, but inside him, a revolution was underway. The past had not been erased but transformed, its lessons fueling a future rich with possibility. And as he closed his eyes, Walter knew this was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would reach far beyond Earth, carried on the wings of courage, connection, and relentless hope. The garage felt warmer that morning despite the chill outside. Light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows over tools, sketches, and half-built prototypes. Walter stood quietly, absorbing the hum of activity around him. Malik was adjusting a sensor, Kayla was recalibrating a pump, and Lila was sketching a new design for the habitat's insulation system. The energy in the room was unmistakable, like a rocket preparing to launch, full of potential and promise. Walter's body creaked with the stiffness of age, but his mind was sharper than ever. Each day, he felt the steady pulse of purpose, a fire fueled by dreams that refused to dim. Over the past months, the oxygen loop system had evolved from a simple concept to a working prototype. The team had faced countless setbacks, but with each failure came new insight, a step closer to their goal. Walter often thought of Elon Musk's words: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That phrase echoed in his mind during long nights of problem-solving, reminding him that the quest mattered far more than the difficulty. Today marked a milestone. The team planned a full test of the oxygen loop integrated with the new water recycling system. This combined setup was their most ambitious project yet, a small, self-sustaining ecosystem designed to simulate life support on Mars. The neighborhood had started to notice their efforts. Curious neighbors peeked in, offering snacks or words of encouragement. Even the local hardware store's owner had begun donating supplies. The project was no longer just Walter's passion, it was a community endeavor. The morning stretched into afternoon as the team assembled components with practiced care. Walter's hands, though slower, moved deliberately, guided by decades of experience. When Malik tightened the final bolt, a hush fell over the room. Walter flicked the switch, and the system roared to life, a symphony of pumps, filters, and sensors working in harmony. The oxygen levels stabilized, water circulated cleanly, and temperature controls held steady. Cheers broke out, laughter filling the space like sunlight. Walter's chest swelled with pride and disbelief. They had done it. The impossible felt within reach. Later, as the group gathered around the table, Walter looked around at the faces illuminated by a shared sense of triumph. These were the people who had restored his faith, not just in technology, but in connection, purpose, and resilience. Rachel stopped by with her children, their eyes wide with wonder at the glowing monitors. "Grandpa, this is amazing," one of the kids exclaimed. Walter smiled, feeling a warmth that no machine could replicate. Yet amid the celebration, Walter's mind remained thoughtful. The journey to Mars was still a distant dream, fraught with challenges far beyond their small garage project. But the spirit of innovation, the drive to push boundaries, was the true gift. That night, Walter joined the Mars Citizen Forum for a live virtual panel discussion featuring engineers, scientists, and space enthusiasts. The theme was Age and Innovation, Redefining Limits. Walter listened as others shared stories of late-life discoveries, new careers, and enduring passions. When it was his turn, Walter spoke about his journey, from isolation and doubt to community and purpose. He shared how Elon Musk's example had been a spark that ignited a flame within him and how mentorship, collaboration, and hope had carried him forward. His words resonated deeply. Messages flooded the chat: "You've inspired me to try again, age is not a limit, we're all reaching for the stars together." Walter felt a profound connection, not just to the people on the screen, but to a larger human story of persistence and growth. After the panel, Walter received a private message from a young engineer named Jessica, who expressed admiration and gratitude for his mentorship program. She invited him to participate in a virtual workshop aimed at designing habitat modules for Mars. Walter accepted eagerly, excited to dive deeper into the work and continue learning. The days blurred together with meetings, design sessions, and experiments. Walter's health required care. He took breaks, leaned on physical therapy, and listened closely to his body's signals. But he refused to let age define his limits. One afternoon, as Walter rested by the window, Malik brought in the latest prototype update, a compact air purification unit adapted from SpaceX technology. Watching Malik explain its function to Lila and Kayla, Walter felt the beautiful symmetry of generations working together, each contributing strengths, each learning from the other. That evening, Walter and Rachel sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the past year's transformations. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "You've shown me what it means to never give up." Walter smiled, feeling a quiet joy that had once seemed impossible. "I've learned that the stars are not just for the young or the famous," he replied. "They're for all of us who dare to dream, who choose to act." As the fire crackled, Walter's thoughts drifted beyond the walls of his home, to the distant red planet, to the explorers who would one day step onto its surface carrying humanity's hopes. He felt connected to that future, a thread woven into the fabric of discovery. In his journal, he wrote, "The journey to Mars is not only about reaching another world. It's about the courage to transform ourselves, to rewrite what's possible. Together, we are the architects of tomorrow." Walter's story had become a testament to resilience, innovation, and community. The garage, once a quiet retreat, was now a beacon of possibility, a place where age was not a barrier but a foundation for growth. As night settled over the neighborhood, Walter gazed at the stars through his window. The vastness of space no longer felt distant or cold. It was a realm of dreams, challenges, and unending hope. And in that vastness, Walter Briggs had found his place, an ordinary man reaching for the stars, surrounded by a community of dreamers, proving that it is never too late to leap toward the unknown. The cold autumn night settled over the quiet town as Walter stood outside, wrapped in his worn coat, eyes fixed on the small screen in his hand. SpaceX was about to attempt another Starship test flight. A moment the world was watching, and Walter felt as if his own heartbeat synced with the countdown on the live stream. Inside his garage, the prototype oxygen loop and habitat model sat quiet, illuminated softly by a single desk lamp. Tonight was bigger than his project. It was a symbol of humanity's relentless push forward, a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever felt forgotten or too old to matter. Walter's breath formed clouds in the crisp air as he listened to Elon Musk's voice over the live stream, calm and determined. "We're doing this not just for ourselves but for all those who believe there's more to life, more to the future, more to what we can become." The rocket's engines ignited, a deep rumble shaking the earth beneath Walter's feet despite the miles separating him from the launch site. Flames roared as Starship lifted off, a towering flame piercing the dark sky. Walter's heart pounded as he imagined the craft breaking free from Earth's grasp, heading toward the unknown frontier of Mars. The night was electric, charged with possibility. Around the world, millions held their breath. For Walter, it was deeply personal. He thought of his own journey, the years lost in silence, the doubts that had nearly consumed him, the sparks of courage ignited by Elon's vision. This launch was more than a test flight, it was a giant leap for all who dared to dream again. The live stream showed the rocket climbing higher, systems humming as engineers monitored data in real time. Suddenly, the feed went dark. A collective gasp rippled through viewers online. For a moment, silence filled Walter's small town, thick with tension. Then the feed returned, and Elon's face appeared, steady and candid. "We experienced an anomaly, but every test, every failure, brings us closer to success. This is how progress happens." Walter nodded, absorbing the lesson in resilience. Failure was not the end, it was a necessary step on the path forward. Inspired, he turned to his own team in the garage the next day, sharing the live stream highlights and Elon's message. "Every setback is a setup for a comeback," Walter said, his voice steady. Malik and Lila exchanged determined glances, their energy renewed. That morning, Walter received a message from the Mars Citizen Forum inviting him to speak at an upcoming virtual summit. The theme, Rising from Failure, Embracing the Future. Walter agreed, knowing his story had the power to uplift others wrestling with their own doubts and obstacles. As he prepared his remarks, Walter reflected on the many challenges he had faced, his body's limitations, the skepticism of family and neighbors, the long nights of loneliness. Yet here he was, still reaching, still dreaming. The summit day arrived. Walter logged in, greeted by a mosaic of faces from around the world, retirees, students, engineers, dreamers. When it was his turn, Walter spoke with raw honesty about fear, loss, and the courage to change. He shared how Elon Musk's vision had been a beacon, how community had lifted him from isolation, and how every failure was a stepping stone toward growth. The chat exploded with messages. "Thank you for sharing your strength, you've given me hope to start over, age is just a number, heart is what counts." Walter felt a deep sense of connection and purpose. The next weeks were filled with renewed activity. Walter's team integrated new designs inspired by feedback from the summit, refining their habitat model and life support systems. Rachel and the grandchildren continued their visits, their curiosity and laughter filling the house with light. Walter's body reminded him daily of its fragility, but he faced each morning with gratitude and determination. One evening, while reviewing sensor data, Walter felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest. Alarmed, Rachel rushed him to the hospital. The diagnosis was a mild heart attack, a wake-up call to slow down. In the sterile hospital room, Walter grappled with frustration. He had worked so hard to reclaim his life, was this the end? But then, he recalled Elon's philosophy, not about reckless risk, but calculated courage. He resolved to listen more closely to his body while continuing to pursue his dreams. Discharged with a plan for recovery and lifestyle adjustments, Walter returned home, greeted by his team's supportive smiles. They adapted their work schedule to accommodate his health, emphasizing quality over speed. Slowly, Walter found a new rhythm, balancing rest with creative bursts. His story continued to inspire others in the Mars Citizen Forum, where he now mentored newcomers facing their own challenges. The community had become a lifeline, a source of strength and belonging. Months later, another Starship test flight was announced. This time, the launch went flawlessly, engines roaring to life, the rocket soaring with grace and power. Walter watched with tears in his eyes, feeling a profound sense of shared triumph. The rocket's ascent was a metaphor for his own life, rising despite obstacles, fueled by hope and determination. That night, as the town settled into silence, Walter sat by the window, gazing at the stars. The sky was vast and full of mysteries, but it no longer felt distant or unattainable. He understood now that the journey was not just about reaching Mars, it was about the courage to reach beyond fear and limitation at any age. Walter's final journal entry of the year reflected this truth: we are all explorers, charting the unknown territory of our own lives. Every challenge, every failure, every small victory shapes the path forward. The stars belong to those who dare to keep reaching. The garage stood quiet, but inside Walter, a fire burned bright, a beacon for all who needed permission to matter, to change, to dream. And as the night deepened, Walter knew his story was far from over. It was, like the Starship, just taking flight. Walter sat in his favorite worn armchair, the soft glow of the evening sun filtering through the living room window. The chatter of his grandchildren echoed from the kitchen as they prepared snacks with Rachel. It was a scene he used to observe with a distant longing, once feeling like a spectator in the lives of those he loved. But now, Walter was part of their story, not just a faded figure in the background. His recent months of engagement with the Mars Citizen Forum and the mentorship program had transformed not only his own life but those around him. The idea of bridging generations wasn't just an abstract dream anymore, it was becoming a living reality. The mentorship program, born from Walter's desire to connect retirees with younger dreamers, was gaining momentum. Through virtual meetings, emails, and online workshops, wisdom and fresh ideas flowed back and forth, fueling a new wave of innovation and hope. Walter's own ments were a diverse group: retired engineers rediscovering their passion for invention, young students eager for guidance, veterans transitioning into new careers. One name stood out among the others: Emily, a 22-year-old aerospace student from Texas, bright-eyed and fiercely determined. Emily had reached out months earlier, inspired by Walter's story and eager to learn. Their conversations quickly evolved from casual chats to deep dives into design challenges and problem-solving strategies. Walter saw in her the spark he had once thought was lost. One afternoon, as Walter and Emily worked through a complex issue with oxygen sensor calibration, he realized the true power of their connection. They weren't just exchanging technical knowledge. They were weaving together experiences separated by decades, enriching both in the process. Emily's fresh perspectives challenged Walter to think differently, while his steady guidance offered her a sense of confidence and grounding. During a virtual workshop hosted by SpaceX, Walter introduced Emily to several engineers, facilitating her first professional networking opportunity. Watching her navigate the conversation with growing assurance, Walter felt a surge of pride. This was more than mentorship, it was legacy. In the evenings, after the grandchildren had gone to bed, Walter often reflected on the societal narratives that had shaped his earlier years. The notion that aging meant decline and invisibility had weighed heavily on him. Yet, through these connections, he was helping rewrite that story, not only for himself but for others like Emily and the many retirees finding new purpose. One night, as he prepared for a forum discussion on intergenerational innovation, Walter received an unexpected invitation. A local community center wanted him to speak at an event celebrating older adults' contributions to technology and culture. The prospect both thrilled and unnerved him. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the thought of standing before a crowd filled him with self-doubt. But Walter remembered Elon Musk's persistent reminder: you have to be willing to be misunderstood if you're going to innovate. Embracing vulnerability, Walter accepted. On the night of the event, the community center buzzed with anticipation. Faces of all ages filled the seats: neighbors, friends, family, and curious strangers. Walter stepped onto the stage, his hands steady despite the flutter in his chest. He shared his journey openly: the years of isolation, the spark ignited by Elon's vision, the power of community and mentorship. His words resonated deeply, drawing tears and applause. Afterward, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Your story gave me hope," she said. "I thought I was too old to start over, but you showed me otherwise." That moment crystallized the significance of Walter's transformation. His story had transcended his own life, becoming a beacon for others navigating the complex emotions of aging and change. Back at home, Walter continued to nurture the connections between generations. The mentorship program expanded, incorporating workshops on emerging technologies, resilience, and creative thinking. Rachel noted how Walter's energy had shifted from a quiet determination to a vibrant engagement with life. The grandchildren now saw their grandfather not just as a storyteller but as an innovator and leader. One afternoon, as they gathered in the garage, Walter watched Malik and Emily collaborating on a new sensor array, their laughter mixing with the hum of tools. The garage had become a microcosm of what the future could be, a place where age was honored as a source of wisdom and youth was celebrated for its creativity. Walter's journal entry that night reflected his evolving perspective: bridging generations is not just about passing knowledge. It's about building a shared future where every voice matters, every dream is valid, and every person is seen. As the seasons changed, so did the community around Walter. The small town embraced the spirit of innovation and inclusion, inspired by the collective efforts of Walter's team and the mentorship network. Local schools invited Walter and his mentor to speak, sparking curiosity and ambition in young minds. The neighborhood became a hub of creativity, proving that age and experience were powerful catalysts for growth. One crisp morning, Walter received a call from the Mars Citizen Forum. The upcoming global summit would feature a new initiative, a collaborative project aimed at designing sustainable habitats for Mars, involving participants across generations. Walter was invited to co-lead a team alongside younger engineers and scientists, including Emily and Malik. The opportunity filled him with excitement and a deep sense of responsibility. The project would test everything they had learned: technical skill, teamwork, and the ability to dream boldly together. As Walter prepared for the summit, he thought back to the moment that had changed everything: the spark from Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of Mars colonization. That spark had ignited not only his own transformation but also a movement of connection, hope, and courage. The path ahead was uncertain and challenging, but Walter no longer feared the unknown. With his community beside him, he was ready to reach higher than ever before. In his final journal entry before the summit, Walter wrote, "Our strength lies in unity. When generations come together, the impossible becomes possible. This is our bridge to the stars." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the town, Walter felt a profound peace. He had journeyed from isolation to connection, from doubt to leadership. The legacy he was building was not just about technology or exploration, it was about humanity's capacity to grow, change, and reach for the stars together. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?